Once again, the Pittsburgh Steelers are one of the more entertaining teams to watch going into 2025. A brand new quarterback, it happens to be a four-time MVP, and a star edge rusher that has now extended Pittsburgh, looking to make it 22 consecutive seasons of 500 or better play. Welcome back to 32 on 32 here on Chase's Sports News, or where we preview each of the 32 NFL team seasons before things do get started with a team reporter. And today we preview the Pittsburgh Steelers' upcoming season with their ESPN reporter, Brooke Pryor. Brooke, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. The timing worked out perfectly since TJ Watt is locked up. So that ends a little bit of drama that we almost had going into training camp. Maybe we'll have a quiet weekend before things get even crazier. But, I feel like I've really jinxed it now.
You just mentioned the extension. TJ Watt, now the highest paid non-quarterback in the National Football League annually. Deal runs through 2028. How important do you believe that extension is for Pittsburgh?
It's really important, I think, to have him locked up going into this season. I was surprised by the amount of money that they gave him because he is turning 31 in October, and that's not old in real world, but in football years, he is kind of. You're never going to say that TJ Watt is past his prime. I am not going to make that mistake, but he has fewer years in front of him than he once did, more years behind him at this point. But I do think that what he means to this team, what he means to this organization, let's be honest, the vibes would be a lot different going into training camp if they didn't have TJ Watt, if that was still a question, that they have made all of these moves and the cornerstone of their defense was in flux. There were, some rumors that perhaps teams were trying to acquire him via trade, things like that. I think that maybe would have hurt their momentum going into this season. But it's also important to note that paying TJ Watt, acquiring Darius Slay, acquiring Jalen Ramsey, all of these moves that they've made might not matter if Aaron Rodgers doesn't pan out to be what they think he can be. If he looks kind of more like the quarterback that we saw with the New York Jets last year,
Sure.
This offense can't score points, then all of these defensive moves, even, acquiring a guy like DK Metcalf is, you hate to say for nothing, but this is a team that hasn't won a playoff game since 2016. They desperately need to win a playoff game. I know that winning Lombardi trophies is what Steelers fans believe to be the standard, but right now the standard is having a non-losing season, and they're not giving out trophies for that. So it's an interesting time in the Steelers organization, but I will say that getting TJ Watt done now and not letting this linger throughout training camp, when it's already been an incredibly dramatic offseason, at least that is not a thing that we will be talking about over the next 4 weeks in Latrobe.
Of course, it's very important, but I have to ask you I know you said he's really never going to be past his prime, and he still had a decent season last year. It led the NFL in forced fumbles for the second time in his career, but we've seen this guy be a defensive player of the year type guy, who's led the NFL in tackles for loss. Last season, it just felt like he wasn't that same contributor. He started the season really well, but in those final 5 games, including the postseason, only 2 sacks, 4 quarterback hits. You mentioned that just recently in one of your articles. Do you believe maybe he's starting to fall off? And if injury problems happen, do you believe this contract can end up hurting the team in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that he was not as productive last year. The numbers said that. I think that he's at a point in his career where he needs to evolve. He needs to take the next step. And I think some of that is maybe not stubbornness, but I think he plays almost exclusively from the left side. Over those 5 games, I believe it was 260 of 261 snaps came rushing off the left side. To me, when you look at, like you just mentioned, the 2 sacks, 4 quarterback hits, he was being schemed out of games. And yes, he was dealing with injuries. He was banged up over that stretch. But when you're TJ Watt and when you are the highest paid non-quarterback in the league, you can't be schemed out of games. You can't get $108 million and disappear. And so I think that, he said at the end of last season that he was open to moving around. If he really is, that's good news for the Steelers. They can get more creative. Terrell Lawson can get more creative. TJ Watt has all of the tools in his toolbox to be effective, I believe, rushing from anywhere. And I think that that's also something that will help Alex Highsmith, that could help Jack Sawyer, their draft pick this year. TJ Watt, he is good because in the past, even when he was predictable in the sense of he's rushing from the left side, he can still just beat you in raw power. But the older he gets, the more you have to be able to move around because you can't rely purely on power and purely on talent. kind of like Jalen Ramsey, you have to maximize where he is at this point in his career. Maybe that means playing more slot. Maybe that means playing more corner. Use his mind and use just the nature of catching the other team by surprise more than just saying, well, they're just going to overpower you. So if he can do that this season, then that's good news. But I mean, JJ Watt dealt with injuries late in his career. Obviously, TJ is not his older brother, but there are a lot of similarities between the two of them and just injury history in general. And those trends tell us that when a player gets over 30, 31 years old, especially at a physical position like the one that TJ Watt plays in the style that he plays, he's going to be fighting an uphill battle. So I'm not going to count him out. I'm not going to say that this was a bad deal for the Steelers because the reality is they had to do it, but it's one that is going to be, I think the Steelers ownership is going to be kind of anxious until they can see him kind of get on the field and turn in some of those results.
You mentioned how TJ Watt can no longer just use his talent to become that elite player in kind of as he gets into the later years in his 30s, because there are a few guys on this roster who have to deal with that problem. Jalen Ramsey, Cam Hayward, Watt, Aaron Rodgers. So overall, this roster is one of the oldest in the National Football League, and that's something that they're going to have to grapple with this coming season. But it wasn't only Watt that slowed down toward the end of last year. It was just the team in general. They were 10-3, a 2-game lead on Baltimore for the AFC North. You don't end up winning the division. You lose your final 4 games. You get the wild card spot, and then you're dismantled by your rival on the road in the postseason. What happened to go start 10-3 and then lose 5 straight? And they didn't really look competitive in those games either.
Yeah, it was kind of a comedy of errors and not a very funny one. I think the biggest thing is that they got out physical in that stretch. And that was really what I think was the impetus for the decisions they made during the draft. When you go and you take Derek Harmon early, you take Y.A. Black later, Caleb Johnson, very physical running back, like top to bottom, this draft class is incredibly physical. And then you look at the moves they made in free agency, trading to get DK Metcalf. Obviously, he has a lot to his skill set beyond just physicality, but that's a hallmark of how he plays.
Right.
The wide receiver room, they're all, as Ben Skoranek will say, they're all dirt bags. This, I think they recognize that what went wrong in that those 5 games that they lose was just, there was a lack of physicality, a lack of energy. It was like once they lost, believe it was to the Eagles, they couldn't get their momentum back. And I have never been, I've been in a lot of locker rooms. The feeling after the first loss in Baltimore, the regular season loss in Baltimore, and then the playoff loss in Baltimore, it felt very odd. It was almost like at the end of the playoff loss, there was some relief that the season was over. They were more upset, it felt like, after the regular season loss in Baltimore than they were after the playoff loss. And I think that just speaks to the state of the team. It was one of those things that the train got off the tracks and they just couldn't get it back on. I also think that you saw Russell Wilson make some really bad mistakes in that stretch. He was, I think, pressing too hard. He was not playing smart football. And there was a reluctance from the coaching staff, particularly Mike Tomlin, to use Justin Fields more. He was there at their disposal, and he was not a weapon that they tapped into. There was some stubbornness, I think, that no, we're going to let Russell Wilson work this out, and it just didn't work. So I think that it was just everything that could go wrong did go wrong, but the number one thing was that lack of physicality on both sides of the ball. And it just kind of, once they couldn't get that back, it was a lost cause.
Look, overall, this team has overhauled the roster from last year. It looks different. They've kept themselves busy during the offseason, to say the least. We're going to talk about the Aaron Rodgers move in a minute, but they also made some other really impactful moves. You're talking about the Jalen Ramsey, Minkah Fitzpatrick, Jonnu Smith trade, the DK Metcalf move, trading George Pickens. Outside of Aaron Rodgers, what stood out to you from Pittsburgh's offseason?
I think you just listed them all off because I was just working on my 53-man preview and my kind of off-season catch-up, and everything that they did is so un-Steelers-like. This is a team that historically drafts and develops. Maybe they pay, 1 or 2 outside veterans in free agency. But when I got to Pittsburgh, I started covering the Steelers at the end of right before the 2019 season started. So I missed that free agency. but they had just signed Steven Nelson. And at that point, he got the highest contract for an outside veteran. And I forget what it was, but maybe in the 20 million range, 17 million. It was not a lot of money in football terms for the Steelers. This year, to trade for DK Metcalf and give him that contract. Now you've got Jalen Ramsey, you're paying him. Jonnu Smith gets some money. Darius Slay, you're bringing him in. This is a team that is changing the way that they do business. And I think that that's a good thing because the rest of the league does not have this antiquated thought process of, well, we can just draft guys and we don't need to kind of evaluate the free agency market, the trade market. It's kind of like Clemson football last year saying we don't need the portal, when if everybody else is going to the portal, you should probably tap into the portal and see what you can get out of it. Same thing for the Steelers in looking at some outside talent. But the Steelers are still remaining true to some of their core principles as an organization. And while they are paying some guys more, they're still, I think, largely dictating who they're bringing in by how much these guys cost. They are still looking for bargains. They're not paying top dollar. That's why they went after Aaron Rodgers and didn't get Sam Darnold. That's why, the Rams weren't going to part with Matthew Stafford, but I still don't know that the Steelers would have been able to pay him what he wanted.
Sure.
The Steelers in general are still trying to instead of getting an up and coming guy that's commanding kind of top of the market right now, they're looking for the guys that are on the back end of their careers, name brand guys who once were top tier, like a Jalen Ramsey, who they have that name recognition. They're not the player they were a couple of years ago, but the Steelers are hoping that there's enough left that it's worth bringing them in. And because they're not at their prime, you can get them at a little bit of a discount. So, and of course, in this situation, it helps that they're getting guys at a discount because then you do have money to pay TJ Watt, even though that's not kicking in for a little bit. But that was my biggest takeaway, that while, yes, they are changing a lot about how they move, they're still remaining true to themselves in trying to kind of shop the discount bin, look for like last season styles on the sale rack. And we'll see if that works out for them.
Overall, I don't think that's a long-term recipe for success at the quarterback position, because you look at the teams right now that win the Super Bowls, it's the one that not only pay their quarterback, but they pay a great one. I mean, anyone could pay their quarterback these days. Trevor Lawrence is on a $275 million deal. Dak Prescott makes $60 million a year. But the ones who find their hidden gem at quarterback, or maybe not even hidden, and then finally pay them, those are the teams that are competitive. The Baltimores, the Buffaloes, the Kansas Cities, the Philadelphias, then the Cincinnatis if things go well. So you're right. Pittsburgh eventually will have to find that long-term solution at quarterback. The short term, though, seems to be Aaron Rodgers. He's wearing the black and yellow. The 4-time MVP is in Pittsburgh, but he only seems like a shell of his former self. I mean, last year, things did not go well in New York. You mentioned it earlier. And this team looks worse on paper than what he had in New York when he was struggling there. So I guess my question to you, Brooke, would just be, how do you see this whole Rodgers situation? How do you see him operating in this offense, considering he probably has less weaponry than he had in New York?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question, or I guess the $10 million question, because what Aaron Rodgers does is not really what Arthur Smith wants to do or what the Steelers want to do. Arthur Smith, when we talked with him in the offseason or talked with Mike Tomlin, Omar Khan, the goal was to be a balanced offense, if not a run-first offense. They've invested so many resources in rebuilding this offensive line. Obviously, they let Najee Harris walk in free agency, or not give him the fifth-year option. But they drafted Caleb Johnson. They've still got Jalen Warren. This is a team that is building from the trenches out. Aaron Rodgers is a quarterback that threw the ball the most or the second most times in the league last year. And granted, a lot of that is dictated by circumstance, but Aaron Rodgers wants to have the ball in his hands, and he wants to be the one to call the shots. Arthur Smith did not a big piece of contention with the Steelers offense last year is that Russell Wilson felt like he didn't have the ability to change the play call at the line of scrimmage, that he was kind of handcuffed by Arthur Smith's play calls. Aaron Rodgers doesn't want to be handcuffed. That has been a thing throughout his career. And he's tried to push back on that narrative a little bit since he got to Pittsburgh and say that, that's not a thing. that he has demanded, but there has been reporting throughout that he wants that freedom. And so I think that there could be a power struggle unless they can come to a compromise. But I do think that this is a situation where if he can, when we talk about, raw talent versus being smart, if Aaron Rodgers can kind of take a step back and recognize, hey, I'm not 35 years old. I'm not 36 years old. I'm not playing at my MVP level. I need to get the ball out of my hands, give it to the guys who give it to my playmakers, let them run the ball, have a balanced offense, rely on guys to get a lot of yards after the catch. I think that can work. Use some play action. Really, the blueprint should be what Arthur Smith did with Ryan Tannehill in Tennessee. If they can do that, great. But that is going to require Aaron Rodgers to kind of take a step back and not, demand the level of control that he has wanted throughout his career.
And I think kind of the other thing too is with this whole Aaron Rodgers situation is you're talking about a run heavy offense. You also kind of need that elite running back as well sometimes, and we'll see if Jalen Warren can kind of provide that rushing stability. I think it really shocked me, even though there were all these reports that Rodgers could go to Pittsburgh. I still never thought it would work because you're right, he does kind of have this demanding personalities. He hasn't been that flexible. It feels like throughout his career, and Mike Tomlin and the Steelers don't seem like an organization that's going to bow down to this guy when he comes in 1 year. So I am very curious to see how that does play out. Since Roethlisberger has retired, Pittsburgh has started a different QB in week 1 than they have in week 18. Sometimes that's due to injury, and sometimes they just have to switch things up. Let's put injury aside because that is a risk for Aaron Rodgers in his 40s. But say he just disappoints. Do you think there's a possibility that that someone else steps in like a Will Howard by the end of the season?
Could be. It's funny. I was at an event. Calvin Austin did a meet and greet at an ice cream shop, and I stopped by and got talking with this older woman who was there. And she was, to show you how polarizing Aaron Rodgers is, she said that she hopes that by like week 3 or 4, that Aaron Rodgers is benched or has given up or something, takes himself out of the equation, and that Mason Rudolph comes in and saves the day, which is wild because, like I said, I started in 2019. That was the year that Ben's elbow went out week 2, I believe, and it was Mason Rudolph, Duck Hodges. Mason Rudolph has the altercation with Myles Garrett. Like, Mason Rudolph was maybe one of the most hated people in Pittsburgh in the AFC North. And now I have Steelers fans saying, gosh, I really hope Mason Rudolph can come in and take over this offense. So that is
God bless him, because football wise, Mason Rudolph's not the savior, I don't think.
right, a wild turn of events. But it is important to note that in, what was that, 2023, I believe all the seasons run together because they have just been all so chaotic. But he came in after Kenny Pickett got hurt and Mitch Trubisky flamed out very quickly, and he got the Steelers to the playoffs. The offense looked its best when Mason Rudolph was starting down the stretch. So the good thing about Mason Rudolph is that he is very, I think, he's consistent, he's safe, he's not risky, he's not going to turn the ball over. And I think that he is a smart player. He's not the long-term answer. I don't know that any quarterback on this roster is the long-term answer, because even Art Rooney said before they drafted Will Howard in a radio interview that whatever quarterback they took this year was a developmental project. There could be things in Will Howard that eventually turn into be a good quarterback. He's got the leadership, he's got the skill set. I don't know that he projects as a starter at any point, but I think that he can, maybe late in the season, if things are really sideways, he gets an opportunity. But to me, when I look at what they could get out of this year, if it's not Aaron Rodgers, if he gets hurt, if whatever happens, I think it really sets up for the 2026 draft in Pittsburgh. The script writers are really working overtime with the possibility of the Steelers being able to draft the future of their franchise in front of a hometown crowd. They've got comp picks to move up if they need to, because I don't think that this is a team that's going to bottom out and get a top 5 pick or something like that. They'll have to move up the board. But to me, I think that that's what their focus has to be on, especially since Rodgers has already said he's probably retiring after this year. So, I think you have enough Band-Aids behind him to get through, but it's got to be about the future and seriously scouting this class. You can't afford to take another swing on a guy like Kenny Pickett and have that fall apart and just get farther and farther behind in the franchise building process.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning, and we keep kind of circling back to it. This is one of the more interesting situations because you don't want to blow it up. You have a decent core, but without a quarterback. And in the National Football League, you can't really go anywhere without an elite quarterback. So that is going to have to be the question, and we'll see how Pittsburgh operates. Real quick before we break down the schedule, I think defensively this team looks as good as ever. We're talking about some of these guys extended. You got Jalen Ramsey in there, Derek Harmon you drafted in the first round, Malik Harrison for linebacker depth. You added Patrick Queen last year. Overall, it's just this team looks like they're at a decent spot defensively. How are you feeling about the defense this coming year?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is a lot of depth. The one position, though, that I have a big question mark on, and like I said, I was just working on my 53-man roster. Right now, my pre-camp projections, I only have 3 safeties on my projection, and that's because there really aren't any other ones. I think the 2 other guys were Sebastian Castro and I believe Quindell Johnson is his name. Those are guys that I had not heard their names until earlier this year, and even so, the recall isn't there yet because they're just not they need more depth. I think that this defense is another free agent signing away from feeling really, really good about it. Maybe you're adding a guy like Justin Simmons or Jordan Whitehead or Jordan Poyer. I think that they need to add that. Granted, they're going to be playing in sub packages. Jalen Ramsey, even if he's not classified as a safety, could be out there with Darius Slay and Joey Porter Jr. Get Beanie Bishop on there too. They have enough pieces, they can get creative, but still I think that for depth's sake, they need to add another free safety. And then the defensive line is very top heavy. They do have, a good core of 3 guys in Cam Hayward and Keanu Benton and Derek Harmon that you look at and you feel good about. Y.A. Black, I also would feel good about him, but he's young. Beyond that, it kind of drops off. They don't have Larry Ogunjobi. They don't have Montravius Adams, some veterans that, while they dealt with injuries and weren't always super consistent, you still, I think, felt better about that veteran depth versus depth that includes guys like Isaiah Loudermilk and Logan Lee, who was injured all of last year, DeMarvin Leal. I think that they need to add some more quality depth or hope that some of these rookies really pop during training camp to feel like, okay, this position can handle any attrition that's happening during the season.
We're going to have to see what happens. We do this for every single season preview. Let's take a quick look at the schedule. Just tentatively, this is kind of what I'm thinking. And yes, I know that's a scary number for Pittsburgh fans. I do have their first below 500 season in a little while. But when you look at the schedule, it's 10th hardest in the NFL based off of opponent win percentage from last year. But starts out pretty easily. You got that Vikings game in Dublin, but you have the early bye. Overall, schedule at the beginning is really easy. It gets really brutal, though, towards the end of the year. What stands out to you from the schedule?
If this happens, that would be crazy. I say it would be crazy. It would be crazy because Mike Tomlin's never had a losing season.
Right.
But the Dolphins one is interesting. Week 15, losing to the Dolphins because that game's in Pittsburgh, right? So that would mean that the Dolphins have finally figured out a way to play in the cold, which there's a first time for everything. I think that they could flip that game. The Chargers game, that's Sunday Night Football, Week 10, got it as a loss. I could see that. I think the Steelers win that game. They're pretty good in prime time, pretty good on the West Coast. And that Packers game, man, I'm excited to cover that one. I think that one's going to go down to the wire. But yeah, looking at this schedule gets me so excited for the season. And it's still July, but I'm ready to kind of fast forward through training camp and get here, especially that week 1 game, the Jets game in New York. That's going to be, I know that when the schedule came out, Aaron Rodgers had not signed, so that only got the 1 p.m. treatment. But that's going to be about as big as a 1 p.m. Sunday afternoon game gets.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you have kind of the revenge game against the Jets for Rodgers, the revenge game against the Packers. He hasn't played Green Bay in his career. So you're going to get that revenge factor as well. There's always something when Rodgers plays Chicago, and you heard the whole thing about, are you going to play Chicago again, when he was kind of spoiling which team he was going to. It's kind of a lot of like revenge games I feel like you have to mark on the calendar. For me, I think the most challenging portion of the schedule is the week 11 through week 16 portion, where if Caleb Williams is improved, and you're right, if the Dolphins can play a reasonable level in the cold, you're playing Joe Burrow, Caleb Williams, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Tua, who's very good when healthy, though that's a big question mark, and Jared Goff, who's the top 10 quarterback in the league. That's a brutal stretch for that defense. And if they have any sort of a drop off, that's going to be challenging. To me, when you look at that earlier portion of the schedule, I have them starting off 4-1. To me, you have to. To me, you have really very little other choices, because if you don't start off well, you are going to be hurt kind of on the back end of that schedule. I guess to me, I feel like overall, I just think something is just going to click wrong with Aaron Rodgers. And we talked about maybe some of the dysfunction. And I just think that overall with this team, Rodgers under center, I just don't see it working out. I don't think he fits their culture. I don't think he fits what Mike Tomlin is trying to say. And I don't know. You look at the 8-9, right? Obviously, Steelers fans, they would at least they don't want to see him go under 500 if it's an 8-9. They would rather than go like, I think, 4-13 at that point and just get a good draft pick. Say it is, though, another 9-8, 10-7 season. This team's probably not competing for a Super Bowl. What's the end goal at this point? Like what should Steelers fans be hoping for? And like, is 10-7 even reasonable? Like, do fans want that? Like, what's the end goal at some point?
It's so hard to figure that out, right? Because if I objectively, as when I look at this, I think you're right. The two best case scenarios are either bottoming out and having like a 3-4 win season, or to me, a realistic goal for the season is to win a playoff game, is to make the playoffs and win a playoff game. I know Steelers fans, that's not enough based on the history of the organization. But given how long it's been, that is, I think, as much a mental hurdle as it is a physical hurdle to win that game. It's not even that they've lost all of these playoff games. It's the way that they've lost them, especially recently. It just hasn't been competitive, and it's demoralizing. And I think that we talk a lot about, the X's and O's and matchups like that, but there's an important thing, I think, to realize. The vibes and the momentum, I think, can factor in just as much. And when you've got a team and a core of guys that keep getting close and losing these playoff games, that's got to mess with your mind. And so I think to get this organization back on track, you've got to win a playoff game, or you've got to come really close. If it's a wild card situation, if it's a situation where you're a heavy underdog and you can get it to overtime, or you can get it to, the other team winning in a walk-off field goal, something like that. Still not as great as winning a playoff game, but it's better than just a beatdown, another beatdown. I mean, the fact that TJ Watt hasn't won a playoff game is insane. You don't want to now pay this guy $108 million to still never win a playoff game. So I think that if they can win a playoff game, no matter what happens in that next round, that to me starts to get the gears going in the right direction, starts to get that momentum picking up for the next season. When you're hopefully drafting your next franchise quarterback, and can really get it turned around more. This is a bridge season, and it either have it bottom out so that it's easier to get that quarterback, or give that new quarterback a head start, a situation where things are feeling better and less hopeless, I think, and less frustrating than it's felt. I think it feels like I've written a version of the same story for every season since 2020, when the first playoff game I covered was during the COVID season, when they lost to the Browns at home and the ball went over Ben Roethlisberger's head on the first snap of the game and turned into a Browns touchdown like 2 plays later, might have been on that play. So they've got to change that narrative. And that to me is a realistic goal and an achievable goal for this season.
I have to ask you one question. We talked about it before. I am a diehard Ravens fan, so I love talking about the possibility of this. If they do have a disappointing season, could they have a kind of backdoor fire, otherwise known as a Mike Tomlin resigning possibility? Because at some point, does he have tenure there, it feels like? Because, I mean, this team, usually if you don't win a playoff game in 9 years, it's like, bye-bye, hope the door doesn't hit your you-know-what on the way out.
Yeah, yeah, I like the way that you phrase that, a backdoor fire Mike Tomlin, aka a resignation, because you're right. This
They're not gonna
ownership
fire
is
him, like, yeah, I mean,
exactly. They're not going to fire Mike Tomlin, especially because that extension he signed a couple years ago, I believe, kicks in this season. So he is coaching what through the 2027 season, I believe. Um, Art Rooney doesn't pay people not to work. If Mike Tomlin were to leave Pittsburgh, it would be purely on his own. He would have to be the one that goes to ownership and says, hey, I'm going to take myself out of this. I feel like I am not effective here anymore. I am going to step away. They're not going to fire him. Ownership's not going to pressure him to resign. It has to purely be him. I don't know that I am going to predict that that would happen, but I think that he is at a point, an Andy Reid in Philadelphia kind of inflection point, where I think that we can acknowledge that Mike Tomlin is a great head coach, that he is one of the best head coaches to ever do it. The way that he motivates teams, the way that he gets every ounce of talent out of some of these teams that have no business having a winning record, or at least a
definitely
non-losing
elevates the
record.
floor of some of these teams for sure, yeah.
Exactly. But at some point, elevating the floor isn't enough. And he could maybe raise the ceiling somewhere else. So we're going to have a fun season of me having to ask those questions toward the end if it, all falls apart and him considering his future. And let me tell you, he does not love answering those. So it's going to be a very interesting season in Pittsburgh. I would say keep a steady supply of popcorn handy.
So you don't think the franchise would at all kind of do what the Patriots did with Bill Belichick, where it's like they ask him to resign? You don't think they would ever go to
I
that
don't
level?
think so. I don't think so. That I would be very surprised if that happened, because the relationship that Belichick and Kraft had felt much more contentious than the one that Mike Tomlin and Art Rooney have.
We'll definitely have to see what happens. Brooke Pryor, thank you so much for coming on the show today in another edition of 32 on 32 here on Chase's Sports News to preview the Steelers season. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Hope you guys did enjoy. Hope Steelers fans listening in did enjoy this. If you guys are just an NFL fan watching this, Steelers are one of the first teams we're doing. We have many more to go right here on 32 on 32. You are not going to want to miss it. So please be sure to subscribe and follow along with the series. Signing off here from Chase's Sports News, I am your host, Chase Coburn.